PCI closed in the green at the closing bell for a third day in a row at 6889.78. That's up by about a quarter of 1%. The broader all shares index up by a little over a tenth of 1% at 4176.54. Some of the index gainers include Ayala Land and Metrobank. Ayala Land up 4.4%. For the week, the PCI is still down, but down by just 2.5% compared to a high of loss of 3% earlier, and that helped knock down the decline for November to 6.9% with just 2 days left in the month. Also for the year, we're only down by less than 1% now.
Please take your seats. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carl Fajardo from the Presidential Communications Office, and I am honored to be here as we celebrate a historic event. Today, we commence the ceremonial presentation of the People's Freedom of Information. We will be launching the FOI manuals of all the participating agencies of the executive branch, as well as the e-FOI facility. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the presence of the following departments: the Office of the Executive Secretary by E.S. Salvador Migueldea, the PCOO headed by Secretary Martin Andanar, the National Historical Commission of the Philippines headed by Executive Director Ludovico Badoy, the Department of Budget and Management, headed by Secretary Benjamin Diokno, the Department of Information and Communications Technology, headed by Undersecretary Eliseo Rio, Department of Labor and Employment, headed by Undersecretary Dominador Sai, the Department of Tourism, headed by Undersecretary Falconi Millar, the National Economic and Development Authority, headed by Undersecretary Jose Miguel de la Rosa, the Office of the Cabinet Secretary, represented by Assistant Secretary Isabelita Somozo, the Department of Education, represented by Assistant Secretary Nepomuceno Malabanan, the Department of Energy, represented by Assistant Secretary Leonido Polido, the Department of Finance, represented by Director Jesus Nathaniel Gonzalez, the Department of Foreign Affairs, headed by the Assistant Secretary Charles Jose, Department of Interior and Local Government, headed by Assistant Secretary Epimaco Densing, Department of Justice, represented by Assistant Secretary Juvie Manwong, Department of Trade and Industry, represented by Director Patricia May Abejo, Department of National Defense, represented by Attorney Norman Danoy, Department of Finance, represented by Director Jesus Nathaniel Gonzalez, Agriculture Department, represented by Director Roldan Gorgonio, Department of Health, represented by Dr. Beverly Lorraine Ho, the Department of Public Works and Highways, represented by Undersecretary Karen Jimeno, Department of Transportation, represented by Assistant Secretary Cherry Mercado, Department of Science and Technology, represented by Attorney Emmanuel Galvez, the Philippine Statistics Authority, represented by Attorney Henedin Palabras, Social Security System, represented by President Emmanuel Dook, Philippine Health Insurance Commission Incorporated, led by Lemuel Untalan, the National Housing Authority, represented by Assistant General Manager Froilan Campitan, National Privacy Commission, led by Privacy Commissioner and Chairman Raymond Liboro, the National Archives of the Philippines, led by Executive Director Victorino Manalo, the Philippine National Police, represented by Police Chief Superintendent Velasquez, Land Bank of the Philippines, represented by Attorney Noel Marquez, GPPB, represented by Attorney Denny Santiago, and we also have our civil society and private partners, the Right to Know Right Now Coalition, headed by Mr. Da Vinci Maru and John Nelvin Lucero, the Asian Development Bank, represented by Mr. Richard Bolt, the World Bank Group, represented by Mr. Hanef Rahimtullah, SIMF, led by Dave Overton, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, led by Mr. Patrick Adams, USAID, represented by Mr. Shins Batung. May we call on the Honorable Executive Secretary Salvador Medialdea to deliver the opening remarks.
Congressman Antonio Tino, DBM Secretary Ben Jokno, Secretary Martin Andanar, Richard Bolt of the Asian Development Bank, Hanif Rahimtullah of World Bank, Patrick Adams of JICA, and Shins Batung of USAID. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow workers in government, today is indeed the best day to greet you with a good afternoon, congratulations, and mabuhay. This day marks a historical, noble, and emancipating period in good governance. This day we launched the Freedom of Information Program of the Philippines. This day we uphold the people's right to information provided for in the highest law of the land. The journey upholding our right to information has been one filled with lessons, hardships, joys, celebration, but even heartaches, yet special moments that ultimately lead us to what we now have, an initial FOI program that shall pave a way for an inclusive regulatory framework so that every Filipino will have an access to information. In the past, FOI was merely a campaign promise that remained just as it is, a promise. People were deprived of accessing public information that would be beneficial for the common good, while at the same time holding government accountable for its action or lack thereof. But indeed, change has finally dawned upon our country. What began and ended as a mere campaign promise in the past has been accomplished in the 3 weeks under the Duterte administration. The executive order establishing freedom of information in the executive branch was signed by the President last July 23, 2016. Executive Order Number 2 of the operationalizing in the executive branch the people's constitutional right to information and the state policies to full public disclosure and transparency in public service and providing guidelines thereof is the realization of this promise. Now we do not only have access to information, we have the research data as basis for policy development. Now we do not only have a transparent and accountable government, but one that espouses the rule of law and the citizen participation. Now more than ever, we do not recognize the fundamental role of open exchange of information such that we maintain the truest sense of democratic governance. Through the FOI and its online counterpart of the eFOI, our government will be able to help the citizens in gaining access to any and all information on matters of public concern. Through this program, we shall learn from one another by sharing our views, knowledge, and craft to better understand the kind of messaging that we want to convey to each other and in the manner that it should be conveyed. The FOI is the best tool to ensure an informed citizenry to exercise their right in the public domain. We hope, with the help of our friends in Congress, the passage of the FOI law will be realized to mirror the FOI in the executive branch across the different branches of government. In closing, I would like to thank the efforts of our partners for change in government and in the private sector for making all of this possible. My sincerest congratulations to the Presidential Communication Office, DICT, the World Bank, the Right to Know Coalition, and all government agencies who have jumped aboard this initiative. Hopefully, by next year, more and more agencies will adopt the eFOI program in their respective departments, and more citizens will be empowered by this. May this event serve the Filipino citizens to be able to conveniently request for government data and information through the various ways and means provided by the Duterte administration. May this also fast-track Congress in launching its version of the FOI for the benefit of the people. Once again, good day to all, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Executive Secretary Medialdea. At this point, we will be introducing to the public the People's FOI Manual. And to brief us, introduce to us the People's Manual, may we call on Presidential Communications Secretary Martin Andanar.
Executive Secretary Salvador Medialdea, DBM Secretary Ben Jokno, Congressman Antonio Tino, sir, Ambassador Charles Jose, ADB Country Director Richard Bolt, World Bank's Hanef Rahimtula, who's been tireless in helping us here. The Right to Know Coalition, the DICT, distinguished guests, my colleagues in the executive branch, the media, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Today we celebrate a story of political will, courage, and hard work. The passage of Executive Order Number 2 was a promise delivered instead of broken. In a time where government vows are sometimes deemed worthless and pledges easily delivered but not fulfilled. On July 23 of this year, President Rodrigo Roa Duterte signed Executive Order Number 2 on the freedom of information, which operationalized in the executive branch the people's constitutional right to information and the state policies to full public disclosure and transparency in the public service. To put simply, the President wanted a government that is transparent, that had nothing to hide from its citizens. He wanted those that hid behind bureaucracy and secrecy to be held accountable. Power always has to be kept in check. Power exercised in secret is doubly dangerous. the freedom of information is key to a balanced power between the government and its citizens. The President signed EO number 2 at a breakneck speed, months after being elected into power and days before he delivered his first State of the Nation address. Thankfully, both the Senate and House of Representatives are working on enacting the FOI into law. The Senate, under the helm of Senator Poe, has passed the FOI at the 17th Congress. Its counterpart in the House of Representatives are now undergoing committee hearings by the Committee on Public Information headed by Congressman Antonio Tinio. We look forward and towards a day where the freedom of information will be an act and not just an executive order. Signing an executive order is one thing. Implementing it so that it can be a tool that gives citizens genuine access to information about the workings of their government is another. For this, I would like to congratulate all the agencies that have worked to implement the freedom of information. The average time to implement the FOI program is 1 year for some developed countries. Our agency and agencies were asked to prepare a People's FOI manual in 120 days. The offices formulated their respective manuals, implementing details taking into consideration their mandate and nature of information. A joint task force led by the PCOO provided workshops for 180 departments, agencies, bureaus across the executive branch, alongside GOCCs and SUCs. In implementing the FOI, we have learned from the efforts of countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, Brazil, India, and Mexico. Mexico has one of the best examples of a well-functioning FOIA. In Mexico, information is not just released to the person who requested it. It is released to everyone. So the information becomes available and it saves time and effort of the citizens and the agency. FOI implementation is a process as opposed to an end in itself. It will require both process and behavioral change within and across the bureaucracy. As with all countries, we are expecting implementation hurdles. However, we are ready to resolve these as they arise. This is why, through an administrative order, we will create an interagency committee for freedom of information so that the government can continuously and consistently improve the ways the public accesses government information under the FOI. The Duterte administration deems EO number 2 as a way to resolve problems. It is not a way to lure support or a window dressing to the growing corruption problem in the country. FOI has been established because the government seeks real change. For the future of the freedom of information will depend not only upon the government, but also on the citizens who will use the FOI. When citizens can freely access information from the government, they deputize. They can regularly check on officials to make sure things are in order. It is the duty of citizens to maximize the right to information, to check on their government. This has been a triumphant day, not only for the Duterte administration, but for the nation. We have a long way to go to create a system in which information is easily accessed from the government without detriments or inefficiencies. But today is the day we take the first few steps in the right direction. Maraming salamat po at mabuhay tayong lahat.
Thank you, Secretary Andanar. At this point, we will now proceed to the ceremonial presentation of the FOI manuals. We will call on the agencies one by one, and may we request the head or the representatives of the agencies to proceed to the stage with a printed copy of your FOI manuals for the formal presentation to Executive Secretary Medialdea. May we also call on Congressman Tino and Congressman Lopez, our FOI champions in Congress, to share the stage with Executive Secretary Medialdea to witness the ceremonial presentation of the manual. May I call on ES Medialdea on stage and Secretary Andanar. Secretary Andanar will be presenting the model FOI manual, which will be followed by other agencies in their crafting of their respective FOI manuals. Dito, sir.
So, ibibigay ko kay Secretary. Yes. Si Congressman Lopez, wala? So, let me know when. No? You. Tinawag muna si Secretary Benjok.
Yes, sir. Let us call on Secretary Yokno. And at this point, we would like to call on stage the first agency who has submitted its FOI manual, the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. Next is the Department of Budget and Management. Secretary Yokno has already presented the manual. The Office of the Deputy Executive Secretary for Legislative Affairs. Legal Affairs. The Presidential Communications Office. The Department of Information and Communications Technology. The Department of Labor and Employment. The Department of Tourism. The National Economic and Development Authority. Followed by the Office of the Cabinet Secretary. Next, the Department of Education. The Department of Energy. the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of Interior and Local Government, the Department of Trade and Industry, the Department of National Defense, the Department of Social Welfare and Development, the Department of Finance, the Department of Agriculture, again, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, the Department of Public Works and Highways, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Science and Technology, Philippine Statistics Authority, The social security system. The Philippine Health Insurance Corporation. The National Housing Authority. The National Privacy Commission. The Department of Agrarian Reform. The National Archives of the Philippines. The Philippine National Police. Land Bank of the Philippines. And the Government Procurement and Policy Board. Thank you, E.S. Magdaldea, Secretary Andinar. Okay. May we call on again the head of the agencies to please proceed in front for photos. May we also call on our private and civil society partners, the World Bank, SIMF, Right to Know Right Now Coalition, Asian Development Bank, and the Japan International Cooperation Agency, as well as the USAID. Thank you, everyone. Refreshments are available. Feel free to fill yourself.